Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the first of this year's ACRL Instruction Section Management and Leadership Committee online professional development events. Today's event, presented by Stephanie Rosen, will focus on accessibility in teaching it with technology. On May 17th, we will have an event about developing an effective mentoring program, and on June 2nd, we will have an event on critical reflection to improve teaching. We hope you will be able to join us for these events as well. Following Stephanie's talk, we will have a question and answer session. Please hold all questions until then or type them in the chat box to be answered during the Q&A. Stephanie Rosen is Accessibility Specialist at the University of Michigan Library and has worked at the intersection of accessibility in higher education since 2010. She holds a PhD in English from the University of Texas at Austin and has presented in many contexts on accessible scholarship, publishing, and teaching. Students bring a diversity of needs to our classrooms. Teaching with accessibility in mind can help us include and accommodate them all. In this webinar, you will learn how to incorporate accessible practices and values into your teaching with technology. This webinar will focus on classroom climate, selecting tools and platforms, presenting information, and training student creators. Stephanie, thank you so much for speaking with us today. Please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Emily. So this is Stephanie Rosen speaking now. Thank you everybody for being here. I'm really excited for this session and for our conversation at the end. So I just wanted to let you know that my notes and the links associated with this presentation are available online at the short link, which is listed at the end of my first slide there. So that is bit.do/May 2017. bit.do/May 2017. And if you type that in just as you see it, you'll be redirected to a simple website that has the notes for this presentation and the links that you may wish to explore further. So I'll just encourage you to follow along there. It largely repeats the information that's available on the slides. So Emily told you a little bit about me. I'm now based at the University of Michigan, where I help colleagues incorporate accessibility into their teaching, scholarship, services, and publishing. I originally got involved in accessibility while working at a digital humanities lab at the University of Texas at Austin during my graduate education. And that's where I also got interested in disability studies, and I've really been working in accessibility in one way or another ever since. So what is accessibility? That's a good place to start. Accessibility has legal and technical definitions as well as broader meanings. And today we're really talking about the spectrum of these meanings. The legal sense of accessibility, which basically means readily accessible to people with disabilities, is defined in the Americans with Disabilities Act. This legislation also defines who is considered a person with disabilities and what type of entities are required to make their services accessible. And this, of course, includes institutions of higher education, both public and private. The technical meaning of digital accessibility is defined in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, now in their second version, 2.0. And this definition is 4 major principles that say web content needs to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And the document goes on to describe the standards for baseline accessibility of online content. But then in addition to these more narrow and more technical definitions, we have a common sense definition of accessibility, which basically means available and usable to anyone in an equitable manner. So while the documents and definitions are very important to what we're talking about today, so too is this more common sense definition of accessibility. Who benefits from accessibility? Well, we are thinking in particular about students or learners with disabilities, but we're also thinking about students in general and other marginalized student populations as well. So for example, choosing an online text that works well for one student's screen magnification software might also work well for another student who doesn't have a laptop and uses their mobile phone to access materials. And likewise, choosing an online video that has captions and transcripts would provide access for one student who is hard of hearing, but also benefits another student who may be working in their secondary language. So I will provide a little demographic information about post-secondary students with disabilities, but I'd like us to keep in mind that this is not the only population we're benefiting when we're talking about accessibility. According to recent surveys of undergraduates, both in 2007-08 and 2011-12, 11% of undergraduates reported having a disability. This number varies significantly by the type of institution and also by student demographics. But on the average, this is about 1 in 10 college students who report having a disability, and students who experience disability is a little bit higher than that. And among this population who report having a disability, 31% report learning disabilities, 15% psychological conditions, 11% chronic health conditions, 7% mobility impairments, 4% difficulty hearing, and 3% difficulty seeing. So I think it's worthwhile just to take a look at this distribution and note that, for example, difficulty hearing and seeing are relatively small populations, but they have extreme needs that must be addressed. And learning disabilities, meanwhile, are the highest, and that represents needs that overlap with a lot of the other groups. So in what follows, we are talking about how to serve these students, but also how to serve a much broader population. Not just students who report having disabilities, but also students who experience disabilities but don't report them, students who are otherwise disadvantaged, and ultimately, all students. And we'll be talking about this in 4 areas: classroom climate, selecting tools and platforms, presenting information, and training student creators. First up, classroom climate. When we're talking about classroom climate, we're generally talking about the way the environment affects learning. Climate is determined by a constellation of interacting factors that include faculty-student interaction, the tone instructors set, instances of stereotyping or tokenism, the course demographics, student-student interaction, and the range of perspectives represented in the course content and materials. This comes from Ambrose et al., How Learning Works. So as instructors, we have the power to control or influence many of these factors. And we have the power to improve classroom climate for specific populations of students. When it comes to accessibility and students with disabilities, a really important part of classroom climate is the way that we approach student accommodations and student learning needs in general, and of course the way that we address disability in the classroom or don't. Faculty-student interaction and communication. So before we even meet our students, there really should be an opportunity for us to learn about accommodations needed by anyone coming into our classroom. This is something that is pretty clearly spelled out in the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're required to provide accommodations for those who need them, and that really starts with providing the opportunity for people to let us know. This can be achieved in a few ways, by creating a question on a instruction request form, if you have one of those in your library, by prompting participants to email you before a workshop, or by reaching out to students or out to faculty in an email message of your own. And if you're wondering about good language to prompt people to let you know, an example here is, please let me know if anyone in the class requires accommodations to fully participate in the session. So the other important part of this is how we respond to those requests that we receive. Well, I think it's worth mentioning that students may not wish to disclose accommodation needs because in some instances they fear that they may be judged, doubted, or dismissed. So how we respond to those accommodation requests that we receive is really a key moment for setting tone in the classroom climate. So one thing that we need to do is know our obligations and know about effective practices for serving students with disabilities. And in order to learn about this, I would recommend consulting a handbook. On my campus, the University of Michigan, our Office of Services for Students with Disabilities puts out a handbook for faculty every year. And if you're following along on the website I pointed you to, you'll find a link to that handbook. You also may have one that's from your institution or from another institution that you find useful. Basically, the handbook goes through all the ways that faculty or instructors can support students, and then goes into the particular needs of students with specific kinds of disabilities. So students who are blind or visually impaired, students with mobility impairments, and it's a great source of best practices in terms of what to do in the classroom, and also when to get help in terms of looking to other colleagues on campus who can help serve students. So looking into a handbook such as this is great in terms of knowing your obligations beforehand, getting familiar with effective practices beforehand. But the other piece of this is also just being willing to consult or collaborate with students themselves, as they have specific knowledge about their learning needs. And I would say that the way we frame student learning needs for everyone is really important for setting tone. Instructors can emphasize positive over punishing language, can demonstrate approachability and empathy, use warm rather than cold language, and create invitations over commands in the way that we write descriptions, give instructions, or just communicate to students their options. So some examples of what this looks like are given in the slide. You need to learn this database to do your research project would be an example of cold language, command as opposed to an invitation. And an alternative would be, this database is the best resource for the research project you're doing in this class. The second example, no food or drink in this classroom can be replaced with a statement like, finish or discard your food or drink before coming into this classroom where we have fragile and valuable materials. So it's a matter of showing respect for the knowledge that students have about their own learning needs and empowering them to make decisions rather than making decisions for them. And a lot of these ideas that I'm presenting right here about positive over punishing language, approachability, and empathy come from this resource called Accessible Syllabus. It's a great resource designed to help instructors design syllabi that are accessible themselves and that also contribute to a classroom climate that's more accessible and friendly to students with disabilities. So the section on rhetoric from this resource is all about these small changes in language that can improve student outcomes. So stereotyping and tokenism. How we treat students with disabilities and how we talk about or frame disability in general is key to mitigating stereotype threat and making students feel included. So there are some basic parts to this, of course. Do not assume that any individual student represents a group or demographic. Do not expect some students to use their research as evidence and other students to use their experience as evidence. But this also goes into the way we talk about disability in the classroom in our language. And using respectful language. So the first piece of that, of course, is to remove offensive terms from our vocabulary and use current and correct language, which is generally person first and emphasizes agency. So that means something like a student with a mobility impairment rather than an impaired student, and rather than a student suffering from mobility impairment. So person first means that we're talking about the student first, not an impaired student, and emphasizing agency, so removing words like suffering or victim when they're not appropriate. We can also make an effort to remove ableist language from our vocabulary. It's still around in ways that we often fail to notice, like crazy or lame, and we can replace those words with more thoughtful and accurate alternatives. So, you know, something like, the old library website design was not insane, but unreal, or my schedule right now is not crazy, but unbelievable. And a great resource on that is a blog post called How I Stopped Worrying and Learned to Remove Ableist Language from My Vocabulary, linked again from the website. And in terms of keeping up with the preferred language, a good resource comes from the Syracuse University Disability Cultural Center, Introductory Guide to Disability Language and Empowerment. Finally, we need to consider the range of perspectives represented in course content and materials. So, is there any representation of disability culture or disability studies in your content? As an example, does your module on YouTube Cultures mention deaf culture and ASL videos? Does your data management workshop mention that technology tools and good file naming practices help researchers manage cognitive overload and memory loss? In short, is disability acknowledged as a part of the human experience and a particular source of knowledge and culture? So this is all about giving students an opportunity to see themselves represented in the materials and giving all students an opportunity to see a range of perspectives represented. I see someone in the chat asked for the link again, which I will add in so you can follow along. I'm trying to follow the chat questions as they come up, but Michelle is monitoring them for when I can't. So I'm moving along to selecting tools and platforms. Perhaps we no longer have a choice about whether we use technology in the classroom, but we do make a lot of choices about which technologies we use and how we use them. And we have the opportunity to let accessibility inform these choices by following a few simple questions. So the first question to ask ourselves is, why am I using this technology? So, except in classes where the technology is the learning content itself, such as a discipline-specific database or a field standard piece of software, we should be able to answer this question with reference to our learning objectives. So if I want students to each annotate an article and then compare their comments, a powerful collaborative online annotation tool like Hypothesis, for example, might be a great tool to use. But so might pen and paper and small group seating arrangements. And if I want participants in a seminar series to discuss the readings before we meet, a class blog or discussion forum may make sense, but so might letting students schedule one-on-one meetings at their convenience. The point here is that for most learning goals, there are multiple modes of achieving them, and we can support diverse student needs by being flexible. So I want us to ask ourselves, is the technology enhancing the ways of learning or participating, or is it limiting them? And it's important to be conscious of those moments when the technology becomes limiting, and really asking ourselves if we can justify that technology being the only way to participate or demonstrate mastery or learn something. This doesn't mean that we have to plan and manage all of the multiple possible modes of participation, but I think it means being amenable to alternatives when a student or a learner lets us know that they need them. The second question is, why am I using this technology? So just as there are multiple modes of achieving a learning goal, there are often multiple tools available for the same or similar purposes. In choosing among them, we can consider several factors that potentially impact our students. So first is convenience. In choosing some software, we might think, does this work on both Mac and PC? In choosing an online tool, we might ask if it works on desktop as well as it does on mobile. Cost. Is the tool free or paid, open source or proprietary? Is it provided by an institutional license? Thinking about that as well. Privacy. Does the tool require an account and login? Do the users retain rights to their content? And what about the use of their data? Questions worth asking when we're requiring students to log in to a system. And finally, accessibility and usability. We want to know, are there any barriers to using this tool? And we're going to look at these more in detail. So the third question is the technology accessible and usable? So we want to know if the technology will work for everyone, or if it will present barriers to anybody in particular. And learning about a product's commitment to accessibility and its compliance with accessibility standards can tell us a lot about this question. And there's several ways to learn about this, even if you are not an accessibility expert. So the first step would be an accessibility pre-check. So this is as simple as going to the product website and just searching for any statement or information about accessibility. I would say that no information about accessibility is a red flag, although beware that a strong statement of commitment to accessibility may not always be accurate. So I've just brought up two examples that I found. On the ProQuest website, you can find a page dedicated to accessibility that goes into detail about a few of their products. On the Omeka website, you can also find an accessibility statement. It tells you what type of accessibility standards they aim to meet and goes into detail about the front end and the back end and what they've done to support accessibility. So both of these are great examples of what you want to see. This is a vendor who's thinking about accessibility, can provide specific information about it, and has contact information to answer additional questions. Looking through a website and finding nothing at all is not a good place to start. So this is kind of what you're looking for. If you don't find accessibility information about a vendor or a product, you can, on their own website, you can look elsewhere to see if anyone else has information. When it comes to library e-resources, you could check out the VPAT repository, which hosts vendors' own statements about product accessibility. And this is maintained by the Universal Accessibility Special Interest Group, which is part of, I think, ALA and ACRL. And when it comes to ebooks, you could look at the eBook Audit Reports website, which has reports generated by an ad hoc testing group of institutions of higher learning in the United Kingdom, performed in 2016. So these are some examples of where you might find additional reviews of product or vendor accessibility out on the web. Sometimes you may find this type of information in a less formal setting, something like a product forum or somebody's blog. So it's worth looking out there just to see what are people saying about the accessibility of this product before you try to figure that out yourself. So that is the next step. There's a great blog post called The 6 Simplest Web Accessibility Tests Anyone Can Do that teaches you how to use a website and look at a few key elements in order to determine whether it has generally good accessibility or whether it has some accessibility problems. And those tests consist of checking for keyboard accessibility, checking high contrast or grayscale, turning off images, checking for captions, checking form labels, removing styles, and finally just using it yourself to see how usable it is. These tests are enough to alert you to the presence of accessibility issues or confirm that a site has good accessibility. It's not enough to identify all the problems or indicate potential solutions, but that's fine. Like I said, this is if you're not an accessibility expert. It's enough to get you started, and it can be really helpful when you're selecting among tools. So I'm going to go into a little more information about all of these checks. So the first is keyboard accessibility. If a website is going to work with assistive technology, all of the interactive components need to work from a keyboard because most assistive technologies emulate the functionality of a keyboard rather than a mouse. So in order to test that, what you need to do is put aside your mouse or let go of the trackpad and use the tab button on your keyboard to move among all of the interactive elements like links or forms, anything that you would be able to click on with a mouse. So you use tab to go forward and you use shift plus tab to go backwards. And what I have on the screen here is a screenshot of the New York Public Library website. And on the left-hand version, I'm using the mouse to roll over all of the links in the top menu. And in the right-hand version, I'm using the keyboard to tab through all of the links in the top menu. So the important thing to notice is that you can indeed get through all these links from the keyboard just as well as the mouse. And you can even see where you are, the same visual indicator that you get with the mouse rollover, you get with the keyboard. That's not always the case, and that makes things much more difficult. But being able to know where you are when you're tabbing through interactive elements is really important to accessibility and usability as well. So that's the first simple check that you can do on any site. And that will really alert you to a lot of potential issues or to generally good accessibility. The next thing you can try is changing the colors to high contrast mode or to grayscale. So what this lets you know is, are there any places where color is being used to convey information? And in the example I have of a small snippet of an infographic, we have a map with data laid onto it and a pie chart with a key beside it. And what we find when we strip out the colors is that a lot of the information available in the color version does not translate when we lose access to that. In particular, the pie graph has different colors denoting different sections, and then a key which tells us what those colors mean. But in reality, those colors are all really similar in terms of intensity, and with any type of color blindness or bad lighting conditions or a really old monitor, you really lose access to that information. Good design that thinks about accessibility uses color and something else to convey information. So an example of that would just be putting the labels of the pie chart around the chart instead of adding a key that means you have to translate the color to the label. So changing things to grayscale can be a really quick way to start to notice when color is being used in this way and alert us to any issues that people might have. Another thing you can do is turn off the images on a website. What I have here are two screenshots of an online archive at the Stanford University Library. On the left-hand side, we have all the original images, and on the right-hand side, we have all the images turned off. And when the images are turned off, they're replaced by a bit of text that's associated with every image called alt text. And ideally, that alt text should be meaningful, accurate, and equivalent to the image. In this example, the alt text really doesn't give me anything meaningful. Clearly, it's meaningful to the database itself because they have a lot of numbers and information, but not meaningful to a user. This is a bit of a difficult example. I don't mean to fault Stanford University libraries in particular, because it's very hard to figure out how to do this well when you're managing a large database of images. But it's a trick you can do to look at a website and think to yourself, if someone did not have access to the original images, would they be able to have an equivalent experience? And you can start to realize when that becomes a problem. So it's just another trick to get at the experience that assistive technology users might have. Another thing you can do is check for labels when you have a form that allows the user to input content. So what I have here are screenshots of the Twitter sign-up page with 3 input fields, one for full name, one for phone or email, and one for password. So when you're out there checking for form labels, you want to find out, are they properly labeled, and are they labeled at all? So in this case, we don't actually have labels for these input fields. What we have is some placeholder text that's doing the duty of a label. And the problem with that is, once I, as a user, start inputting some information, the placeholder text goes away, and there's no way for me to check whether I've input the right information in the right box. So if I put my email in the name box and my name in the email box, I'm going to get an error on this form, but because there's no label, it's not immediately clear why I've gotten an error. So looking if there are labels out there will let you know how usable and how accessible a form will be. And this is something you see, of course, in advanced search fields, any type of database interface. It would be very rare to see something like this Twitter screen. You usually will find labels, but you can get a sense of how well things are labeled and if they are properly done. And then one last trick you can do is you can remove styling, remove CSS from a website in order to get a simple picture of the structure of that website. And what you really want to find out is whether the structure and the order corresponds to the visual presentation of the website. It's also just sometimes very useful to get a sense of the stripped down linear version of the site. So here I have an example from an Open Humanities Press ebook, a page from a book. And when I remove all the styling from this page, I can see that the structural components of the page, like the title of the book, the title of the chapter, are still called out with larger text. That's because they have structural tags applied to them, header tags applied to them. And when you remove all styling, the web browser will still style those to let you know that they're part of the structure. So this is exactly what you want to see. Things are in the same order, things have the same structure, and removing styles can let you know whether the page is coded in a way that will make sense for a user, or whether there may be some problems in terms of ordering and the structure of the content itself, as opposed to the way it's presented. So you can go through all these checks, and you may find that there are some accessibility problems. What to do about it? Well, the first thing I would recommend that you do is report it back to the vendor. Let them know and ask them what they're doing about it. You never know what kind of response you'll get, and it's always best to give them the opportunity to fix something that's wrong. but then you can return to questions 1, 2, and 3. So if you find that a website or a tool is going to be unusable for your students, especially if you know you have a student with accessibility needs in your class, you can, once again, consider alternative methods to meet your learning goals. You can consider alternative tools or platforms that have similar purposes. And you can, once again, test the alternatives for accessibility. So basically just go through the same process. It's best to do this ahead of time than to get to a class and find that a student can't use a tool that you've selected. This just gives you some insight into that experience and the opportunity to choose a better option if it's available. Okay, moving on to presenting information. So there's now broadly available information on how to give an accessible presentation. You can even see it offered by various professional associations for their annual conferences and meetings. And in these examples, you'll see things like describe any images on your slides, repeat audience questions in the microphones, examples like that. And here, I'm just going to basically repeat that type of information, but I've tried to distill it down into a few simple principles that are easy to remember. So for me, presenting information in a way that takes into account different audience needs is all about eliminating distractions, amplifying, and translating. So first, eliminate distractions. Eliminate elements that may interfere with people's ability to concentrate or participate. So thinking about visual distractions, the screen should have as few things on it as possible. So for example, setting up for this presentation, we looked at a few different techniques, figuring out how to get my slides on the screen for all of you, and ultimately decided that we should go with the way that eliminated all of the distractions, all of the extraneous information on my screen, because I wouldn't want you really looking at that while I'm presenting. Thinking about cognitive distraction. One way this comes up is letting participants know if they should be following along with the process on their own device, or simply observing you as you demonstrate it for the first time. And audio distraction. We have to remember to pause video or audio before interjecting, rather than trying to talk over it. So people are forced to listen to both things at once. Amplify. Amplify key information using enhancements. So visual amplification. If you're demonstrating something on a website, perhaps the search bar on a large, busy website, you can zoom in your screen so that you're just showing the search bar rather than all of the content around it. And when you're building your own slide deck, you can make sure that everything has good contrast. Cognitive amplification. You can remember to repeat key points and give signposts to the lesson as we move through it. And audio. We can remember to use a microphone if it's available, to face our audience, and to repeat audience questions for everyone to hear. Translation. Translate content across different senses and modes. So visual translation. Describe the visuals that you show. Images, diagrams, or even live poll responses. If you ask students to respond to questions using a clicker, you can let them know, okay, looks like 50% said A, 25% said B, rather than assuming that everyone can read from the screen. Cognitive translation. Can provide a handout or just write on the board for key concepts or instructions. You can share slides or electronic notes so people can follow along in another medium. And audio translation. We can choose video that has captions, and we can remember to turn them on during the session. When that's not possible, we can provide a transcript as a supplement. And finally, training digital creators. Our responsibility as instructors is to teach upcoming digital creators to incorporate accessibility into their work as a matter of course. So this means teaching good color contrast when teaching poster design, teaching accessible PDFs when teaching dissertation formatting, teaching caption creation along with video production, just incorporating accessibility into our teaching. And this begins by becoming familiar with principles of accessibility yourself, and also sharing good resources with your students. So I'm just going to walk you through a few resources that I found to be really great. They're all on the new side, and they're excellent for yourself or for sharing with your student creators. The first is this do's and don'ts on designing for accessibility posters, created by the UK Government Home Office Digital. This is a great set of 6 posters with design tips for specific audiences, including users on the autistic spectrum, users with low vision, and users with physical or motor disabilities. They're meant to be simple to reference and to promote awareness. They're available to print out, to share with colleagues. They're also available in simple text versions if you're just interested in the content of them. So these are a great starting point, very easy to use, relevant to almost anything. The next tool is this Accessible Color Palette Builder. This is a great tool that takes a color palette you provide and shows you which combinations of colors provide sufficient contrast to use for text and background. It's simple, clear, and gets the point across. So in this example, there are 6 colors. The tool allows you to input 6 colors, and they appear in the far left column, going from the black background all the way to the white background. And the table that it outputs shows which combinations of those colors provide sufficient contrast to be legible. And for those combinations that don't provide sufficient contrast to be legible, they're not shown at all. The message being that you shouldn't use them in those combinations. So I found it to be a really simple, helpful tool. Next, the Vox Product Accessibility Guidelines. So this applies a little more specifically to content for the web. It's a customizable checklist with specific items for different roles, including designers, engineers, project managers, quality assurance, and editorial staff. So you can read through this whole checklist just to get an idea about what's included, or you can select specific checklist items that you want to display for a project, for a guideline, and output a custom checklist. So it's interactive in that sense. It's also just a great learning tool. It can be useful depending on the type of project that you're teaching. Next is this Teach Access tutorial. So this is very much about web content. It's an interactive tutorial that teaches how to write accessible code for the web, so accessible HTML and CSS. It's an excellent resource when learning or teaching basic web design or web development. It's interactive in the sense that the user can play around with the code and see changes to, and preview changes as they would appear on the website. It also has it's a good teaching tool in that it provides kind of common sense explanations as to why things should be done in an accessible way. In the example here, about headings. It explains that when you create a semantic heading, it can be accessed using assistive technology like the voiceover screen reader, and that unsemantic headings, while they look the same, cannot be accessed with assistive technology. So a great exercise that has sections for all the kinds of components that you would be learning in basic web design. And the Accessible Digital Office Document Project. So this resource has detailed instructions on making Office documents, that is Microsoft Word documents, PowerPoint documents, and PDFs, accessible. It's great because it has instructions for each different version of the software. So you can learn how to do something on Word 2011 and how to do it slightly differently on Word 2013. And it stays up to date as those software packages are updated. And finally, a resource on creating accessible videos from the University of Washington. The University of Washington has a great office that is focused on digital accessibility called Do It, and so you'll find lots of great resources there. This particular resource has a good collection of information on the how, what, and why of accessible videos with basic definitions, do-it-yourself instructions, and information about tools and services. All of these resources can inform your instructions so that you're training creators to make accessible digital content. And they can serve as another resource to share with those students who are digital creators. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. We talked about Classroom Climate, about selecting tools and platforms, presenting information, and training digital creators. As you see, accessibility touches every part of teaching with technology, from before the students enter the room to what they make after they've left it. So I hope that this session was useful for your teaching practice. I'm happy to take questions over email. My address is ssrosen@umich.edu. And also right now for the rest of the time we have before the hour.
Stephanie, this is Michelle, and there's one question in the Google Doc. Did you want to check it, or shall I read it to you?
I can get there. Got it.
Okay.
So the question we have here, interested in knowing how to check something for color issues, such as if someone with color blindness can use it. Specifically, if there isn't an easy way to change to grayscale, what tools would you use? Okay. So there are some tools to check for color issues. There's two kinds of color issues that you want to be checking for. One is whether text and background have sufficient contrast, and there are contrast checkers available on the web where you input two colors. It runs some script on them, and it tells you what is like the numeric value of their difference in contrast. And there are standards for the lowest value that can be. So I can share some contrast checkers after the session. But this question is more about color blindness, and there isn't an easy way to change to grayscale. So the reason I showed the example in grayscale is because it's a very effective way to remove color information and alert us to those places where color is being used as the only way to convey information. Basically, in every case, you want color to be redundant. So, for example, the link, if there are links within an article, we would want that text to be a different color and underlined, making it easier for people to see it. If there are slices of a pie graph, we want them to be different color and labeled. so that when you don't have access to the color value, you can still see the difference. So as far as tools for that, one effective way is just to change your display to grayscale. That's how I accomplished that picture for that exercise. That's done in the global settings of your computer. And some computers also have an easy way to change the settings to high contrast, which is another way to quickly find that out. So that's one way, change everything to grayscale. And then there are kind of color blindness simulators on the web where you can take a color image, input it, and then see an output that simulates how it's seen by someone with a particular kind of color blindness. The thing about that is there's a few different kinds of color blindness, so there's like 3 different checkers to use, but that's something that may be of interest, and I can share those as well. Can you recommend ways of talking to colleagues about improving accessibility? Sure. Well, I find that it's useful to have lots of different rhetorical strategies on hand, and then knowing something about your audience in terms of what will work. So for some people, the fact that it is the law and we don't want to be sued is the correct approach. For some people, the fact that accessible practices actually benefit all students and particularly benefit other disadvantaged or marginalized students is the correct approach. For other people, it's more of a personal approach. It's this student is really great, but is struggling because they have learning disabilities, and the way the online syllabus is designed, it's almost impossible for them to use it. So I try to use whatever works. Those are a few strategies that come in handy, but I think it's a matter of knowing a little bit about your audience and adjusting your message to them. And whoever asked that question, I'd be happy to talk more if you have a particular situation you're dealing with. Do you have any recommendations of programs or websites to convert from PDF to Word for screen readers? No, I do not. A lot of screen reader users will convert a PDF to a simpler document format in order to work with it. So I could check with a colleague who is a screen reader user to ask what he used. I think he uses something that converts it just to straight text, not even Word. So I'll have to look into that one. I can follow through the chat and see who asked, and I can get back with you on that. Are there good tools for adding captions to video? Is the accessible syllabus on the web? Okay, second part of that question, yes, the accessible syllabus is a project that came out of Tulane. It's available on the web, and I will share it in the chat. It's a great place to start. As to the first part, do you have, tools for adding captions to videos? Yes. So it depends a little bit on your video production workflow, but I would say that a simple workflow that works in most situations would be using YouTube to generate automatic captions and then manually correcting them using best practices for captioning that can be found on the web in the Caption Key, which is a website produced by a public media captioning organization. So I can share that. This is the simplest workflow in a lot of instances because it takes care of the timing for you and has a relatively user-friendly interface. So YouTube has this artificial intelligence that listens to the video and creates captions automatically. They are not sufficiently accurate to really provide access, but they are a great starting point, especially when the audio quality is good, and you can use them to clean them up into usable captions that will provide access. There are also, of course, paid services that are getting increasingly cheap. So when you have a high content of video, that's usually the best way to go. Question here, how do you think universal design and learning and accessibility go together? Well, as I explained in the beginning, there are kind of narrow versions of what accessibility means, such as the definition you'd find in the ADA or the definition you'd find in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And there are broader versions of accessibility, like what you might mean in a common sense use of the word, like is that book accessible to undergraduates? So in trying to talk about the full spectrum of those meanings, I'm trying to get at the principles of universal design, which are basically about designing things for a broad range of users rather than accommodating things for users with disabilities in particular. So while I do think it's important to center the needs of users with disabilities because, well, they're real users and we're required to make things usable for them, I also think it's important to remember that they're not the only population we're serving when we're talking about accessibility, and that there are a lot of additional populations who benefit. So for me, that's how it connects to universal design, which is really a set of principles and a philosophy that's about serving a broad range of users through good design rather than accommodating particular users through accommodations or modifications. Those are all the questions that I can see in the Google Doc, but I realize that people are carrying on the conversation in the chat. I've just not been able to catch up with it all. Okay, and this person is saying that universal design and learning are not the same. So universal design and learning generally refers to the application of universal design to educational contexts, much more often K through 12 contexts than higher ed, but it has to do with accommodating a variety of learning styles and providing multiple modes of learning, participating, and demonstrating mastery of concepts. So that's something I tried to get at when I was talking about why are we even using technology and bringing everything back to our learning objectives and trying to anticipate a variety of learning needs and thinking of technology as a way to be flexible in how students may participate or demonstrate mastery rather than the only way they can do so. So remembering that technology should not become a limitation, it should be an enhancement. People still rolling in with these questions, but we're getting to the end of the hour. So I would love to catch up with everybody somehow. I can follow up with our organizers to see how that might be possible, but I think the easiest thing to do would be to look to that website I shared today. I will update it after our session with those resources that I mentioned in the Q&A. And if there are any follow-up things, please just email me. I love talking about this stuff, so I'd be very happy to continue the conversation with anybody here.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. This is great.